look at IGF-1 on paper. What happens to it when you're fasting? I'm not saying you shouldn't fast, by the way. I'm just saying from like a growth anabolism standpoint, people who argue in favor of like fasting for look at your growth hormone, like you're getting so much muscle from this downstream. It's like, no, actually your IGF-1 is going in the toilet when your GH is like at its highest. It's not, it doesn't convert and do all this stuff that you want in an anabolism context unless you have the sufficient like substrate from like an insulinogenic aspect. One thing we should touch on that I think would be great is us discussing the other day the mechanism of growth factors downstream on hypertrophy and like satellite cell proliferation and whatnot. Because I remember I asked you guys about that whole like insulin competing for IGF-1 BP3 binding sites and the effects it would have downstream on like why insulin and GH would be concurrently like a 1 + 1 = 3 effect, because no one seems to be able to explain it in like layman's terms. It's kind of just like a jumbled up, like, you know, a bunch of scientific jargon that doesn't actually make sense when you extrapolate it out. So I was wondering if maybe you guys wanted to break that down for people to actually understand like why the fuck you would combine them. Is it to relieve stress off the pancreas and the beta cells like Palumbo says? Is it for this? Is it for the downstream cascade of growth factor production that's significantly increased when you use insulin as a with the GH, or like what is it exactly?
All of it, basically.
First thing we should say is that in growth hormone treatment among I think growth hormone deficient people, but I'm not completely sure. But growth hormone treatment tends to raise insulin levels by about 400% in some studies. So you already have a higher insulin level when you're using growth hormone, potentially because of what Palumbo was talking about, that insulin resistance, overproduction from the pancreas. So basically, to give it the background, people have been saying that use insulin with GH to relieve stress on the pancreas because insulin makes you acutely insulin resistant. The problem is insulin resistance is at the level of the receptor, not just at the level of the pancreas. So it doesn't really fully make sense that throw more insulin, it'll unlock that receptor, right? But I'm not saying that's not the case. Maybe it does relieve some stress from the pancreas. Maybe something that would relieve stress more is a GLP-1 agonist, to be honest with you, maybe in combination.
I think the main argument behind that is like less insulin output needed to bring down glucose levels because you're otherwise chronically leaving them elevated, thus inducing more stress on the pancreas to maintain them at homeostasis. And then you're relieving the burden to less insulin output needed relative to lowering glucose is the idea, I thought.
The problem is that the insulin sensitivity loss can be very substantial depending on when you time the growth hormone.
Wait, let's take a step back. Sorry, just Derek, I want to point out something. You were saying that so the idea behind it is produce less endogenous insulin to reach that level of whatever insulin you need. But why is that a point? Just to make clear to the audience, the reason is because historically it was hypothesized that type 2 diabetes occurred via overproduction of insulin from the pancreas, causing the death of beta cells at the pancreas. A hypothesis that is very much in question. So anyway, continue. Sorry, Steve. Yeah, I interrupted.
So when you take growth hormone at various dosages, I think beyond 1 or 2 units, you get so much release of free-form fatty acids into the bloodstream that insulin, right, like you mentioned, doesn't act at the receptor anymore, the insulin receptor. So these free-form fatty acids inhibit insulin receptor substrate 1, which lowers insulin sensitivity and how insulin responds with the receptor itself. So there's very little glucose uptake. Now you can mitigate some of that with IGF-1, which also overlaps with the insulin receptor and has its own IGF-1 receptor, allowing for nutrient uptake. So this is why the timing of growth hormone is so efficient or important, because if you take growth hormone before activity, allowing you to metabolize through energy expenditure some of these free-form fatty acids, then if you take carbohydrates a couple hours later, the insulin, which is released either from the pancreas or through exogenous use, should be active again. Because these free-form fatty acids, that whole issue of inhibiting insulin receptor substrate 1 is already mitigated through activity.
Yeah, but there are multiple mechanisms by which growth hormone causes the insulin resistance. I believe they are not even fully elucidated, and there's several of them. But what I wanted to point out, so Derek brought it up to you and me and Steve in the conversation by saying, like, if you use insulin concurrently with growth hormone, can you sort of track the IGF-1 binding proteins to make more free IGF-1 in the bloodstream, which probably potentially true, but I just felt like it misses two important points. One is the IGF-1 binding proteins are integral to its use in the body. Specifically, I mean, I haven't reviewed this, but specifically, at least I know IGF-1 binding protein 3, extremely crucial for its effects in the body. I don't know if it binds to insulin, but my goal wouldn't be to get it bound to insulin. The second thing is, the second thing it's just, sorry, Steve, 1 second. The second thing we surpassed is insulin by itself is anabolic. Insulin by itself increases IGF-1 as well. So that's the main issue. Like we said about those fat kids that have high IGF-1 levels, their growth hormone doesn't work, but the IGF-1 is so powerful that they still grow taller.
Well, you have, for growth hormone, there's a receptor which binds to growth hormone in serum, and it's a truncated receptor. So it's actually active in the bloodstream and then allows for membrane activity once it attaches, similar to the sexual hormone binding globulin receptor complex, where sexual hormone binding globulin delivers androgens to tissue and activates additional signals, which are non-genomic, so not through the DNA directly, through the cell membrane. So even though it's bound to a growth hormone receptor or an IGF-1 binding protein, doesn't mean it's inactive. Mm-hmm. And especially with IGF-1 binding protein 3, it's directing its active through the cell membrane. So you take insulin, it starts potentially binding with IGF binding protein 3, but you know that it's much more complicated than that. So a couple takeaways here is not overdoing any of these dosages, right? If you want synergy between all three, the growth hormone, the insulin, the IGF-1, timing is highly important when you take each compound, and not to overdo one over the other in unique relations to each other, because otherwise you miss out on the synergy which occurs within the cell.
Okay.
And then you need nutrients. Also, a lot of people forget this. I take insulin, so no. Hyperplasia occurs when sufficient amount of nutrients are in place to reproduce the DNA and divide the cell. So, a lot of people forget this. I'm going to go on a cycle with GH, insulin, and IGF-1, but you still need the nutrients in place to actually facilitate hyperplasia. And when all of that is in place, right, and IGF-1 and insulin facilitate nutrient partitioning for hyperplasia, then it's highly anabolic.
And to be clear, insulin also modulates by itself many downstream growth factors. When you're in a hyperinsulinic state, a lot of growth factors become activated. Maybe similar growth factors as IGF-1 and growth hormone, but some may be slightly different, or the potential may be higher. So there's so many ways in which it may help.
It's something a lot of people, I think, overlook is like the relationship, like you mentioned, how insulin presence is necessary for the production of some of these growth factors. Like when people hype up the sauna or whatever for its GH spiking properties, or like fasting for spiking GH, it's like, look at IGF-1 on paper. What happens to it when you're fasting? I'm not saying you shouldn't fast, by the way. I'm just saying from like a growth anabolism standpoint, people who argue in favor of like fasting for, look at your growth hormone, like you're getting so much muscle from this downstream. It's like, no, actually your IGF-1's going in the toilet when your GH is like at its highest. It doesn't convert and do all the stuff that you want in an anabolism context unless you have the sufficient like substrate from like an insulinogenic aspect.
Which is really interesting, Derek, because if you think about it, sometimes these fasting guys who are less like scholarly but more like speakers will say, during a fast, the first 3 or 4 days, your growth hormone spikes up, which causes you to be anabolic, which maybe, I think it happens through ghrelin, by the way. I think ghrelin, the hunger hormone,
for sure.
growth hormone, and the growth hormone makes insulin resistance, so you retain, it's not the growth hormone that's making you retain stuff, it's more the ghrelin's effects. But it's interesting, if that was the goal of the body, why wouldn't it raise IGF-1 also?
Yeah. It goes in the toilet during fasting. It's like the total
because
antithesis.
Liver glycogen stores deplete, and if you want highest IGF-1 secretion, you need growth hormone and facilitating liver glycogen stores through the consumption of carbohydrates with a little bit of insulin release. I think that's the scenario where most IGF-1 is produced.
Yeah, maybe that's like one of the best layman terms ways to explain and summarize the whole thing is like, obviously there's different aspects that have been mentioned and touched on too, but also like without the presence of insulin there, you're not getting any of that downstream growth factor conversion. So your exogenous GH is not doing all the things it's capable of doing from a bodybuilding aspect without sufficient insulin.
Sorry, Steve.
So what I've noticed, I've fasted with basal insulin in place, Lantus. I'm not going to talk dosages, it's single digits, highly dangerous. Don't do what I do. then your IGF-1 stays reasonably in range.
Mm,
But then again, mine is like 200. So reasonably in range for me is not substantially high.
that's high for the fast.
Yeah.
That's a high level. Yeah. Some
Yeah.
people-
So that's 1 unit of growth hormone, 1.2 unit of growth hormone every 4 hours while fasting, and the basal insulin upon waking.
Oh wow! I have a lot of new fasting protocols. We should get into later. That'll be
Yeah,
fun.
yeah, yeah. I fasted 6.5 days last week. I just
Yeah, we have
uploaded
to talk about.
my
I know.
video.
Yeah.
6.5. Damn, dude. Nice.
Yeah, it was tough because I didn't use any pharmacological aids.
Oh my
So
God.
no liraglutide. Yeah,
Psycho.
I'm surprised I got videos done. Psycho. I feel
Really?
good though. I feel clean.